2030 is a 15-year scheme created by the United Nations, and it's designed to sell global socialism as a form of poverty reduction.
I think the best description of Agenda 2030 was actually given by the head of the UN General Assembly when this was being negotiated. He called it the Master Plan for Humanity. And I think that was a really, really good term. I imagine God probably had a good chuckle about that. But they really do view it as this comprehensive plan that's going to govern every area of human life: law, environment, business, family, education, healthcare.
There's always been a group of people that thought they had a level of intelligence that was so unique that they needed to dominate the world. And the problem with that is they're always wrong. They always do something wrong, and it ends up in a disaster. And each one thinks that they have this ability to solve all the problems of humankind, and none of them do.
What they're trying to do is they're trying to give people the idea that we can fight global poverty, we can solve the problem of hunger, we can solve the problem of homelessness, and through these solutions, what they're really doing is they're setting up a form of global governance, world socialism, a centralized power outside of all national boundaries, bound up and unified and codified by the United Nations itself.
And so it really is a huge plan that aims to, in their words, transform every area of life. No one can be left behind. In other words, every person on the planet is expected to participate in this plan.
So it is a soft sell of globalization to the rest of the modern world.
History is truly at a turning point. We do not yet know the full extent and the systemic and structural changes which will happen. In times of crisis, the role of governments is more important and more relevant than ever. To go beyond crisis management and to look into constructive ways we can build our common future.
There are 17 goals of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They are part of the Agenda 2030.
It actually reminds me quite a bit of the old Soviet plans. You know, the Soviet communists would come up with these 5-year plans and 100-year plans, and the UN is doing something very, very similar.
So you have to remember the background to this is that back in 1992, they set up something called Agenda 21, where they were, again, trying to sell this idea that we can harmonize and hegemonize all people and have them all have, you know, a set of property where they will be able to sustain and develop their own families and have their own crops and have their own health. They'll be taken care of by the state, but they'll also be able to sustain their own lives.
You have Agenda 21, which is the agenda for the 21st century. And then they've broken it down into smaller segments. So from 2000 to 2015, we had the Millennium Development Goals. From 2015 to 2030, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals.
So they started working in the United Nations, and they created these 17 goals, now called the Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals are generating a blueprint for creating this world globalist society.
I think the world it will create is a sort of freakish hybrid of fascism, communism, technocracy, and ultimately global totalitarian government. If you go into the 17 different sustainable development goals that make up Agenda 2030, what becomes immediately apparent is that fulfilling a lot of these would require unlimited government power. And we're not just talking about national government power, as they make clear throughout the text of the agreement. We're talking about power at the international level.
Goal number 1 is to end poverty in all of its forms everywhere. Goal number 2 is to end hunger. Goal number 3 is ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages.
You can't take on these sort of enormous challenges like solve world hunger or solve poverty unless you have humanity effectively write a blank check to the United Nations. You can take as much of our money as you want. You can take as much of our power, our sovereignty as you want in order to supposedly solve these alleged problems. They market it as if it were an attempt to solve these alleged problems. I don't believe it is. I think it's a naked power grab. No totalitarian ever said, hey, I want to make you a slave. They always, it's for your own good, slaves. Of course I want to help you. Of course I want to give you food. So you have all these kinds of empty promises that we've seen over and over and over again over the last 100 years, from the National Socialists in Germany, the International Socialists in the Soviet Union, Cuba, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola, China, etc. But it always ends the same, with gulags, mass murder, starvation, and government control over everything.
For correctness, whether you believe that I have been diligent, that I have worked, that I have advocated for you in these years, that I have been decent, I have spent my time in service of my people. Now cast your vote. If yes, then stand up for me as I have stood up for you.
Goal number 4 is all about education. They want to make sure that everybody's got access to education at all levels for all stages, so free college, free public education, free daycare. Everything is going to be free and provided for by the state.
And I think education is probably the single most important front. Right now, they are indoctrinating about 80% of American children in government schools, similar numbers around the world. So education is really, in my view, the primary mechanism these evildoers are using to bring about this diabolical agenda. And that's not my opinion. You can just read their documents and you'll see that. If you go to Agenda 21, which I mentioned is the 100-year plan of the UN, the agenda for the 21st century, chapter number 36 deals exclusively with education. And they actually say right in the text of the agreement that it is indispensable for changing people's attitudes. They say it's got to give children the right attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors that will be consistent with sustainable development. They say it has to include spiritual education, which, by the way, they mean something very, very different than Christians have traditionally understood. And the same is true with Agenda 2030. If you look at goal number 4, it's dedicated exclusively to education, and it's designed to sound nice and non-threatening. But if you just dig right under the surface, you see very clearly what they're doing. They say that by 2030, all learners, right, there will be no exceptions, all learners will be so indoctrinated, they won't just submit to this agenda. The term that the document actually uses, they'll promote sustainable development, gender equality, which is UN code for smash the patriarchy, destroy the nuclear family. They'll promote human rights, which in UN speak is quite literally the opposite of what Americans have traditionally understood as human rights. Right? In America, our founding fathers said God gave us rights, the right to life, the right to liberty, etc., the right to property. When you look at the UN's own documents on human rights, it's exactly the opposite. Right? You look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Who gives you rights? Not God, but government, international agreements. And if government and international agreements gave you alleged rights, well, then of course they can take them away. And they spell that out. Article 29 says none of your rights and privileges may be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. So the core of their effort to move humanity in this direction is the indoctrination of children. And so parents, I think, have an enormous responsibility here to protect their children from that indoctrination. They're moving very rapidly toward a globalized one-world education system that they tell you openly will be used to bring the next generation along with this agenda. So I think that's actually the most important battlefront. And I don't believe that running for school board is actually going to fix this problem. The system is systemically bad. From the very beginning, it was designed to turn the children away from God, turn the children away from love of their country, turn the children away from their parents and against their parents, and it's become very, very effective for that. So I do think the central battlefield is actually education, the minds of the next generation, and I do believe that they will either succeed or fail based on whether humanity allows their children to be indoctrinated into this.
Goal number 5 is to achieve gender equality and to empower all women and girls. Goal number 6 is to ensure access to water and sanitation for all. Goal number 7 is all about energy. They want to have access to affordable, reliable, sustainable energy in all of its forms. So gasoline, oil, electricity, everything.
As we move away from profit as really the motivator, we're moving into a whole new economic paradigm. And it actually has a lot in common with the technocratic ideas of the 1930s that were coming out of Columbia University, where energy rationing would kind of be the organizing principle. We see it expressed a little bit differently today in terms of what is your carbon footprint, what should your carbon budget be. So I think carbon footprint is the rationale for one of the biggest scams ever played on humanity in all of history.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. Where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? what are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker.
And it starts with the language, right? Carbon. We're not actually talking about carbon here. We're talking about carbon dioxide. People think of carbon as black and dirty and nasty. Carbon dioxide is invisible, and it's plant food. It's the gas of life, is what many scientists I've interviewed have described it as. But carbon has a really nasty connotation. And so when they say carbon footprint, starts with the assumption that there's something wrong with carbon dioxide. First of all, from a scientific perspective, that is utterly ridiculous. The planet is actually starving for more CO2, is what numerous leading